So the next presentation will be a little bit of a discussion about silviculture and stand management. So assuming that we get trees established and growing or managing existing established stands, what are some of the considerations involved in designing thinning projects, thinning treatments, and the such? So just a little bit about what oak woodland stands may have looked like prior to European settlement. Doug talked quite a bit about the effect of the herbaceous layer and the exotic annuals that came in during the when the Spaniards settled California. But we think probably a more perennial herbaceous layer, more regular fire interval. Doug will say quite a bit more about that during the second talk he has. The overstory layer was probably more open as a result of the regular fire interval, and we have some long-term plots that have indicated that many of our stands now are denser than they may have been during a time when we had more regular fire regimes taking place. Doug did talk about soil moisture in his presentation and soil bulk density, and the riparian zones may have been denser and the herbivore densities were likely lower. So in coming up with a silvicultural prescription for a woodland stand, a number of important considerations need to be made. What is the current species composition and the desired species composition? What's the crown cover percent? The distribution of diameter classes in the stand. And Doug talked a little bit about the distribution of seedlings, saplings, and mature trees. Those are certainly important elements as well. In designing treatments in the oak stands, being able to ensure that there's adequate wildlife habitat elements that Greg Giusti talked about in the very first week of the webinar: snags, woody debris, cavities. How can we recruit for those to ensure that they are maintained in the stand? Fuel conditions, the presence of ladder fuels and such. Doug will likely say more about that in just a moment. Acorn production is an important consideration. There is a detailed discussion of this in Chapter 9 of the oak guidelines that you all received. There's a system in there of categorizing the the acorn production in the stand, and regeneration status. How many seedlings, saplings, and such do you have? And I'll present a key that we use in assessing regeneration status towards the end of the talk here. I'll talk first about some thinning considerations and pull up very quickly some thinning of blue oaks and interior live oaks that we've done. And then in the guidelines booklet, we do have a table that I'll point you to how to use of determining sustainable harvest levels. We'll also talk a bit about some additional regeneration issues that a framework for assessing regeneration status, and then some oak sprouting models that we've put together. So first, a thinning study that we did in the southern Sierra Nevada in the Tulare County area up near California Hot Springs. We looked at 3 different levels of thinning, and the rationale for doing the thinning there was because of the effect of fire suppression and the denser stands than there may have been historically. There was a fire frequency of 5 to 15 years up to about the early 1960s, and then fire exclusion for about a 40-year period until we did the thinning. The stands were about 55% canopy cover, and those of you who are into forestry measurements, almost 100 square feet of basal area. We thinned to 2 different levels, thinning 2/3 of the basal area and 1/3 of the basal area. And for those of you who don't know what basal area is, it's the cross-section area of the stem at breast height, or 4.5 feet. Standard unit of measurement of density of the stand. So we thinned to 3 different levels, and some of the things we found out from thinning is that forage production was enhanced at the 2/3 thinning. So at the 1/3 thinning, which had about a 30% canopy cover still, the forage production wasn't significantly enhanced over the control. Stump sprouting was quite good in all of these areas that were thinned, but over the 15 years or so since we did the thinning, we saw a gradual loss of the sprouts due to rodent girdling. This was an area that was ungrazed, and we had heavy buildup of thatch, and we did have large rodent problems with the resprouting survival that Doug talked about earlier. A very interesting thing that we got that we did not anticipate is that the thinning resulted in enhanced acorn production. So the probability of acorn production increased with the level of thinning. And in 5 of the 7 years that we measured acorns in the thin stands, we did have significantly increased levels of acorn production. Our friends in Spain that actually are quite interested in acorn production for acorn fattened hogs in their woodlands have known this for centuries and have actually thinned to enhance acorn production in their Mediterranean woodlands. But for us, this was the first time we were able to document it. A little bit of information on the effects of thinning. The highest volume growth occurred on areas that had 1/3 thinning level. So 2/3 we actually reduced the overall volume growth. We did, for some reason the graph's not coming up, but it'll come up, I guess, and eventually. We did get the highest crown growth at the 2/3 thin level. We went from about a 12% cover after the thinning up to about a 30% cover 14 years later. And the thing that thinning did do is we had almost 3 times the diameter at breast height growth and higher height growth with the thinning that took place. Also down in the southern Sierras, we did a thinning with interior live oak, and there's also been studies done with coast live oak that Cal Poly San Luis Obispo has done in the coastal areas of California from Santa Barbara up to San Benito County. Our interior live oak thinning looked at very dense areas, over 100%. 100% canopy cover. It was essentially a 40-year-old stand that had come in after a previous wildfire. Currently a very high fire risk, very high fuel levels, and the forage production was non-existent in the dense cover. We designed 2 thinning trials, 2 thinning intensities in this area as well, and in half of the plots we also treated the stumps so that they would not resprout, because this was such a prolific sprouter. And here's a graph of the volume growth that we were able to get, and the volume growth of the 1/3 thin actually was the highest, much as we had with the blue oak. The control was still growing, but at a decreasing rate, and the 2/3 thin was also growing at a faster rate than the control on a stand level basis. This shows how the stand crown cover changed over time, over 14 years. The unthinned stand averaged about 95% canopy cover. Thinning 1/3 was 60 to 70% canopy cover, depending on whether the sprouts were controlled or not. And thinning at the 2/3 level, we actually had grown back almost to 60 to 80%. So the crown grew very rapidly in these thinned live oak stands. Once again, we had enhanced acorn production as a result of the thinning, so that was a positive effect. So for a person interested in, Doug talked about the possible effects of fire. Fire may have thinned out our stands, kept them more open, and had an enhanced regime for effective pollination to occur and seed set. Also, that would enhance the production of mast that Greg talked to us about during the wildlife presentation a couple weeks ago. Once again, the individual trees grew more quickly, actually almost 5 times faster in diameter growth in the 2/3 thinned area, and about 2.5 times faster in the 1/3 thinned than in the controls. The growth was approximately the same for the control and the thinning 2/3, and about a 50% higher stand growth with the 1/3 thinning level. So I want to just reference to you one of the guidelines we give you in the book that you received on establishing thinning levels to tie in with your management goals that we talked about in the first week. So the approach we use is to think about what your current standing volume is, and we expressed it in terms of cords per acre. There's a methodology outlined in the guidelines book about how you can actually calculate how many cords per acre you have. We have some volume tables and some data sheets that you can use to collect data from plots. Those of you who are going on the field trip will have a chance to do some of this in the field when we are at one of the 3 locations. But based on the current volume per acre, we crosswalk that to how much crown cover there is, and then we tie that in with what your long-term goal is. Is your stand currently too dense for your management goals that you have out there? You may be interested in hunt club and forage production and long-term wildlife, so you may want to thin back if you have a very dense stand. If you have a very open stand, it may not be desirable at all to reduce your density much below where you're at right now. So this table allows you to crosswalk between your management objectives, and we provide you with some very generic descriptions about what the different canopy covers and thinning levels might lead to in terms of the stand values. We give you a couple of examples in the guidelines book there, and I'll just show one right here. If a stand has about 20 cords per acre with a 50% canopy cover, and you got that from a series of plots that were established in the stand, and the management goals for this particular stand were to improve the grazing capacity. So in the long term, we would like to maintain our canopy at about 75% of its existing level. So over the long term, we would like to maintain about a 35 to 40% canopy cover. Currently, there's very plentiful seedling regeneration, but the sapling regeneration is lacking, much like that schematic that Doug showed in the earlier talk. So based on the 20 cords per acre and maintaining a 75% oak canopy level, I highlighted in red on the screen there what the canopy level would be, and how many cords per acre could be harvested on a 20-year harvesting cycle. So for this particular example, if your goals were to thin back somewhat to still maintain 75% of your canopy cover, over a 20-year period, you could cut 5 to 7 cords per acre every 20 years and probably have adequate regrowth to maintain your desired stand structure in the long term. We discuss in the guidebook there some considerations about maintaining the oak cover or to maintain the seedling regeneration and sapling regeneration to make sure that you're going to have recruitment over the long term. And some of Doug's considerations would tie in there. So that's the results of what the example provides for us. Also in your guidebook, we have a key that we suggest using for assessing oak regeneration. It's tied in with the health and vigor of your overstory trees, whether or not you're at the canopy cover that you currently desire, and whether some kind of tree harvest and thinning is consistent with your management objectives. And I'll just show you a quick example here, and then we'll end. This is in Chapter 9 also of your book, and the same example is also provided in your book. But if a current oak cover is 15% of a blue oak foothill pine stand, there was a firewood harvest about 15 years ago. We think the stand probably had a denser canopy cover because we see stumps and we see a larger canopy cover was likely to have been there when the firewood harvesting occurred. We don't see good stump sprouting in this particular stand, and really few seedlings and no saplings. So that's our example of what we see out there. Using this key, first question is the oak canopy consistent with management objectives, yes or no? And we say no, because the current canopy is 15% and we desire a canopy of 25 to 35%. That was based on what our goals were for that stand. So the canopy cover is too low. We're asked the question, is the canopy cover too high or too low? Or in this case, it's too low. And we're asked the question, is recruitment present and adequate? And actually, as in our observations, there was poor stump sprouting and few seedlings and no saplings, so the recruitment is not present and adequate. We're asked the question then, did the site formally support greater oak cover? So using that, yes, it did formally support greater oak cover based on the fact we see stumps out there and we didn't see a lot of regeneration that came in after the firewood harvest. So working through the key in this example, this is a perfect way a perfect place to attempt some of the techniques that Doug just provided to you in terms of recruitment. I think with that, I'm going to stop right there, and we'll shift gears into the next presentation.